Herzlich willkommen zum Filmgespräch im Rahmen des Filmfestivals der Menschenrechte. Mein Name ist Katharina Gerund und ich habe heute die große Freude, mit unserem Gast, Gianvito, über seinen jüngsten Film Her Socialist Smile zu sprechen. Gianvito has said himself that making films, writing about films, even having time to simply watch a film is a privilege. And of course, talking about films is a privilege too, especially if the filmmaker is present himself. So welcome, Gianvito. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Nuremberg International Human Rights Film Festival.
It's my pleasure. And I'm grateful to have this film shown in Germany. Helen Keller considered Germany her spiritual home, she once said. And so I'm glad her words and spirit are returning to that part of the world.
Yeah, let me start with a very obvious question. The project of making Her Socialist Smile has been long in the making. And I would therefore like to ask you, why Helen Keller and why now?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a project that had a very long gestation and dating back 21 years ago when I first became cognizant of the fact that Helen Keller was indeed not only an ardent, but even a militant socialist, and it fascinated me. And I did some research. I found fairly easily some of her writings on her political ideas, and was struck by how contemporary they seemed, how so much of what she was saying still had resonance to the historic moment. And even now, another 20 years since I first discovered that, they still have great currency, it seems to me. And as you know, I think, in general, what we tend to learn about Helen Keller in grade school is that she almost miraculously learned to read and write and to speak. But what she ended up reading or writing or speaking about, that part of it is never kind of focused upon. So this is an attempt at a corrective of that, but it's also not intended as a biography of Helen Keller. It was an attempt to really explore and consider her ideas and the ideas that I think have usefulness to many of the struggles we're facing right now. And if people become a little more receptive to those ideas because they recognize it as beloved a historical figure as Helen Keller could have thought about these ideas very deeply and expressed very eloquently why these ideas have value, that then I think the film serves a purpose.
Mm-hmm. So I think, in fact, your film does resist and deconstruct the familiar narrative of Helen Keller that you have just outlined for us, the kind of almost infantilized, spectacularized, and sometimes sanitized version of her life as this incredibly, successful activist on behalf of differently abled people who is overcoming all odds and having this successful life. And what you do in your film is kind of, even though it's not a biography, I think you do rediscover what Sacha Cohen has called the forgotten radicalism of Helen Keller in that film. And I was wondering how this objective of telling this other story about the ideas of Helen Keller influenced the conceptual and aesthetic choices that you have made in putting the film together.
Mm-hmm. Well, the form of the film was arrived at through a slow, deliberate, organic process, and grew out of the situation of discovering that there existed virtually no archival materials that documented, at least in the traditional ways that films document, this large swath of her adult life. I never came across any motion picture films of her giving speeches in a political context. There are recordings of her giving speeches at other congresses and social events, but not the more overtly political rallies that and meetings that she attended. Nor did I find audio recordings of that, and only a handful of images. And the film itself explains part of the reason why those materials may have vanished, but I think only partially. Her principal archive remains at the American Foundation for the Blind in New York, where she worked for the last 40 years of her life. And there's evidence that, at least in their early years, I do not think this is at all the case with the directors of the organization today, but in its foundation, the chairman of that organization would remark that privately that it was often an embarrassment to he and other members of the board that Helen Keller would associate with communists or near communists, and I found a note that someone had written who had gone through just the photographs of Helen in the foundation. There were approximately 2,000 photographs, and they said there was only one photograph that showed her looking upset or sad, and on the back of that photograph was written in pencil words to the effect that, very unflattering photograph, discard, throw out, but it hadn't been. But it indicates that there was a willful intention to present a certain kind of image of her to the public, and arguably, given the political climate of those times and their sincere desire to raise funds for the blind, it was no doubt made clear to her that if she wanted to help with that mission, that she needed to kind of cease and desist on the strong political statements she had been making prior to joining the organization. That said, there's also in some of the literature a mythology that there was a window of maybe 15 years from 1910 to the early 20s where she was radical, but that she changed her views throughout the remainder of her life. Well, if you look deeper into her diaries and her letters and so forth, she never disavowed those feelings, and but I think she did understand the nature of the commitment she was making to the foundation and what that would demand of her.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about the text that you chose to show for us to read in the film. And you've just mentioned that she never disavowed those beliefs, that you've really dug into her diaries to find those convictions and ideas that you also work on in the film. How did you decide which text passages to use? What were your selection criteria? Where did you take the material from, and why these passages?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. I haven't actually been asked that before, and I was just, I can just describe the process. I amassed as much material as I could find, read all the decent books that are out there, but principally her own writings. And over the years, and this again is a privilege, not everyone can certainly do this, but one of my techniques is to almost randomly pick hotels in different places and just bring all my writing and materials there for as long as I can manage it, and have no distractions whatsoever, and the internal pressure that I'm paying for this, so I have to really focus. And I just started marking up, highlighting the passages that spoke to me the most, and that because again, the idea was that this was a film about ideas, and so how did she first become captured by the notion that there were other people thinking about how the world could be organized in a different way that would be more egalitarian, would be more just, and what were the methods to bring those ideas into practice. And so how that led her to Marx, how that led her to the work of the industrial workers of the world. And the difficulty was sometimes, because she was such an incredible writer, was holding back. In fact, there was an earlier version of the film which was significantly even longer, and over time I was willing to gradually let go of some of it. But as you can see, there's a lot more text on screen than you would find in almost any documentary, and I knew I was sort of pushing the limits a bit of what people find comfortable in a movie, and but it does strike me as curious that that's considered a radical idea that you would actually have to read while you're sitting in a movie theater. If I put all the text together, it would probably be a short story. It's not to me, a demanding thing to ask of people, but you do get some resistance from some audience members. But it's a film about a radical, so why not have the form reflect that as well?
And I think also, Helen Keller accessed the world so much through reading and books and the written word. So it also made sense to me that the film is centered on the written word in some sense, right? Precisely,
because that is how the word, that she always said, this is literature is where I don't feel disenfranchised. It was her utopia, she said. It was how she received the world largely, and it's also how she communicated to us. And I could have had an actor perform as Helen Keller and recite this, or I could have done it all in voiceover. And to me, you wouldn't have really heard her voice as much as you do when you have your own private relationship with the reading.
I think one thing that I also felt your film is asking viewers to do is to reflect on their own sensual perceptions. And somehow it tries to capture cinematically how Helen Keller might have perceived her world, right? And the senses she relied most on is, of course, touch and smell, and senses that might not be immediately available in the audiovisual medium of the film. So how did you try to make sense of that, seeming paradox? It seems to me there are several strategies that you use to try to bring these senses into the film, and I would like to hear more about what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, it was another sort of revelation in the journey that I took with getting familiar with Helen, is discovering just how vividly she could describe her natural surroundings, which in much of her writing she does, and as if she had all her senses available to her. If you were to just read the passages where she describes being alone in the forest, or hours she would spend just lying in her garden, and and since I myself have a deep abiding need for a daily dialogue with with our natural surroundings, and because I have often wanted in my films to reflect somehow my belief that human beings are not the center of the universe, and that we need to keep reminding ourselves that there are all these other living friends around us that deserve our attention and respect. That discovering that in her writing was a portal that opened up, and I thought, okay, beyond the shared love we have for socialist ideals, here was another spectrum that would allow me to bring in something else into the film. But I might seem disconnected, but to me, there's a politic about our relationship to our natural surroundings that aligns with every other aspect of the film. So with that, I did try to film, as you said, in a kind of tactile way, without, I hope, kind of leaning too heavily into, okay, you're now seeing the world through Helen's eyes, and this is, her POV. But to bring out that sensuality of the surroundings, and then I made this wonderful discovery, probably about 6 months into the making of the film. I kept reading in her writing. She'd lived in different places through her life, but she would regularly say that the happiest she was in the years she spent in this one house with her teacher Anne Sullivan, and at that point Anne's husband John Macy, who was also a socialist, and it turned out that house was a 10-minute drive from where I currently live, which I had no knowledge of ahead of time. So the nature that I was filming in my own backyard was very close to what the kind of vegetation and animal life that I think she would have encountered. And then I eventually did actually film at her house, as you see in the later part of the film.
Yeah, I actually found it striking. This was actually supposed to be my next question, to ask you about the relationship to nature that both Helen Keller and you seem to share, and the kind of politics of including these images. And you've already answered that in anticipation of the next move here. I would still like to ask you to comment a little bit on the kind of sound that you use in these scenes, and the way you contrast that with the music in general that we hear in few moments in the film, and how you try to maybe create kind of like the moments where we really focus on the visual, the moments where we really focus on the audio, also on the voiceover. So it seems to me that you try to foreground different senses at different moments, and how you bring all of this together in the film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I keep falling back on this term organic, because there wasn't a theoretical undergirding that I had envisioned where I set out to construct a form that mirrored the fact that Helen lived in a silent world, and yet communicated as eloquently as any public, praised public speaker. I had these texts that were the core of the film. I myself don't like to read with other noise around. I don't like to have music on or anything when I'm reading, and so the silence just seemed necessary. realized I did need some context around the material, and that would bring voiceover into the film. I thought it was an idea I'd had for a previous work, and I set aside. But I like many documentary filmmakers, this is an old issue about the so-called voice of God narration, the invisible narrator. And I thought, if I'm going to again use any kind of narration in my film, why don't we at least just see the person who's doing that and humanize them? And so by just making that decision, that sort of foregrounded part of what you're saying about, our heightened attention to spoken word, and then to silence, and then there's music as well. There are a number of ingredients that an audience doesn't need to know, but that have their roots in all the reading that I did about Helen. So you hear, for instance, a little a piece by Enrico Caruso, and there was a big news story at the time of Helen meeting Caruso and holding his throat and listening to his voice. She wrote, many people don't know that she wrote a book-length poem called "The Song of the Stone Wall," that she writes about she imagines the history of those stone walls and the inhabitants, the Native Americans and the early settlers in and around her community. So that's why stone walls found their way as a motif through the film. She loved horseback riding, which many people wouldn't think Helen Keller did, which is why horses appear in the film. So there's a reason for most of the things that happen, but sometimes they're also just intuitive things that I had a rightness to me in the process that now seem to make intellectual sense as well, but that I really arrived at just very, very intuitively.
Has your relationship to Helen Keller changed while you made the film? So you've really, paid attention to all the details, her writings, what you like, what you dislike. How has your relationship to that icon, to the person behind the iconic image, how has that changed while making this film?
Well, I think I had a fairly shallow picture of her prior to making this, and I do worry about even my own work contributing in a different way to any kind of hagiography around Helen, because like all of us, she had her flaws, and there were other things that I could have included in the film to show that. But again, I wasn't making a biography about every aspect of her life, and I really had this narrow focus on just her political ideas, but there were, I was very moved to read about her love life and the ways in which that she was sort of deprived of exploring a particular relationship in her life by the people around her. I was amused by, how feisty she can be, and she was a pretty hard drinker, and would write about her martini recipes, and I think I even felt like she had what today we would call a sort of punk spirit, which is maybe what led me a bit to the punk song that ends up in the film. I quite like her. I feel like we would be friends. I was very touched recently by getting out of the blue. a few weeks ago, I got an email from a gentleman who had seen the film and was complimenting me on how much he learned from it. And I noticed at the end that his last name was Keller, and he didn't say any more than that. And I wrote back, and it turns out that he is Helen Keller was his great aunt and godmother, and he too said that this was a source of conflict within the broader family. But I do think any contemporary writing about her today would include this side of her. I think we're living in a more enlightened time around that. But in terms of her relationship to disability politics, I mean, that's also a bit complex, and she didn't personally have close friends in that community. She did help legislation for to provide workshops and employment for the blind and deaf, but they were sort of sheltered workshops that weren't really integrated. And there are other things that, define, a full portrait of who she was. But and in the last part of the film, where I quote from her that chapter, thoughts that I forget the title now myself, thoughts that keep me up at night, or that she is fairly self-aware of her own contradictions and struggles.
Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating on the changing relationship to Helen Keller. And I think that the film actually does its part in helping changing people's perception of her. At least that was also my experience. And I want to end maybe with one last question, if you allow me that one.
Sure.
I think you've said that your films fall into a category of films for which there is an absence of proof regarding their significance for radical change or social change. And you said in the beginning of our conversation very humbly that you hope that these ideas, get out there, and that this is what your film can do. And I just want to invite you as a last comment to maybe say what you actually, what you hope your film actually does achieve beyond that, or how it could contribute to social change on a broader scale, because I think it does have the potential somewhere. And I would really like to hear you speak about what you dare to hope beyond the very humble idea of bringing out the ideas of Helen Keller to the world.
Well, I appreciate that. I do believe, though, that all artists need to have a lot of humility about feeling that their work can make meaningful change in the world, though that aspiration remains, or I wouldn't be doing it at all. And I've taught for many years a course called Cinema and Social Change, and I know that, in fact, there are ample evidences that films have made significant change. In terms of this project, I've been telling people that recently, and sort of later in my life, I'm afraid, but at least I'm finally starting to read some of well, let me show you what I'm reading. So I don't know if you've read any Gramsci, but he has this well-known idea of what he calls the war of position, the war of position and the war of maneuver. And his idea is that in order to foster significant political change, the first step is that you really have to get the ideas on the table. People have to at least even be thinking about them. And you know, we've been moving here in the US through a long period in which the very term socialism is just hurled as this pejorative that at any kind of modest, you know, progressive legislation. And, you know, it's laughable how often they call people socialists who I wouldn't even qualify, in my view, as that. It's laughable, but it's also tragic. So, but I do think the polling shows, at least among younger people, that there's a greater openness to that. And as my film tries to remind people that there was not so long ago, it was a completely legitimate form of political organization that had been on the rise, and that many thoughtful people, including Helen, but many other notable people from the early part of the last century found value in those ideas. And so, if my film can again just contribute to that positioning of just let's you know, not see this as a dirty word, and it can, you know, as we know, it can be mean many things to many people, and it's a very general umbrella of what's understood by that. I like, for simplicity, I like what I heard the musician Billy Bragg recently say, that he calls socialism organized compassion. And I also felt that my including of that little lecture by Noam Chomsky, where he very succinctly helps us dispel the ideas that people have, that they equate socialism with what happened under Stalin, and thereby dismiss its practical exploration in the world. So yeah, I'm you know, when I was working on this, I was not at all sure that, in part because of the formal choices I was making, that it would get that widely seen. And I'm pleased that festivals like yours and many other places have found this worth their time. And if it 100 years later, if it helps Helen's voice be heard again, then I've done my job.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting Helen Keller's ideas on the table, your own, for taking the time to talk to me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for being here, Gianvito.
My pleasure. Take care.